Hello everyone, my name is Emma Wozniak.
And I'm Lucy Lawler, and we are the Lantern's Arts and Life editors.
Welcome to our very first episode of Report.
As seen on Instagram, TikTok, and various other social media platforms, the report format advises viewers on what to read, eat, play, obsess over, recommend, and treat themselves to.
And each episode will focus on one letter of our report. So for today's show, we will be kicking it off with every book lover's dream.
And what might that be, you ask? You'll have to stick around for this episode of Report. So the first book we will be talking about today is Sula by the one and the only Toni Morrison, published in 1973. We actually both read this book in high school.
We did.
I have my high school annotated copy right here with my name on the side.
Yes.
Such a gorgeous,
love it.
Gorgeous time of life. But the book essentially tracks the friendship of two women, Sula and Nell, throughout adolescence and eventually adulthood, and they live in a small, very static town of Medallion, Ohio. And it's just sort of tracking how their lives change and how they sort of grow apart from each other as Nell conforms to convention and Sula breaks convention in almost every possible way. And Toni Morrison just puts such lyrical prose onto the page. It's sort of impossible to not get lost in her words. Everything is so vivid and beautiful, but also very tragic and frustrating at times. It's just a beautiful capsule of emotions in my mind.
Yeah, it very much feels like one long poem. Like she has a very poetic, eloquent way of storytelling that I feel like really sets her apart from a lot of other authors, which is why, even though, you know, I feel like it's maybe a little bit hard to relate to in high school, I feel like I still appreciated just the artistic value of it in the fact that her phrasing of things is just unbelievably eloquent. So I'm a big fan.
She also works in some sort of dreamlike qualities, dreamlike situations. She sort of blurs the line between what is real and what is imaginary, and that's something that I personally love. I know it's not for everybody, but I like that ambiguity in my books usually. And then we do have a quote that we want to shout out real quick. It's probably one of the most famous quotes from the book. I see it on a lot of literary blogs and just online a lot. The part that I want to focus on is it's basically stating, like, if Sula had paints or clay or knew the discipline of the dance or strings, had she anything to engage her tremendous curiosity and her gift for metaphor, she might have exchanged the restlessness and preoccupation with whim for an activity that provided her with all she yearned for. And like an artist with no art form, she became dangerous. So that sentence to me is just unreal.
Yes.
Heavy-hitting, beautiful. It's just such a beautiful simile from her, and it's a sentence that has stuck with me in the years since I've read this. I read it when I was a senior in high school, and I will just never forget that specific portion of the book. I just think it's so beautiful.
Absolutely. So now taking a bit of a complete 180 from Sula, I have chosen Frank Herbert's iconic 1965 Dune to talk about. Very temporally relevant. Dune Part 2 is coming out in just a few days, which I personally am very excited about. Dune is a science fiction novel. It's also a coming-of-age story about Paul Atreides. He is the son of the Duke of one of the great houses in this universe, and he and his family are sent by the Emperor to the planet Arrakis, which is commonly known as Dune. And it's really just about how they adapt to life in this new, very inhospitable climate. Dune is like notoriously known for not being able to really host life because it's essentially just a desert. But it's about how his family tries to make their way there, and the warfare and the politics of it all is very intricate, but it's also at its heart, like I said, a coming-of-age story, and it's about Paul trying to find his way in this new world and figure out who he is and who he wants to be as he continues to grow up. So it's a bit overwhelming in plot, I will definitely concede that point, but it also, at its core, is just about a teenager trying to find his way in the world, which I feel like is very relatable to our audience. And so if you have any hesitations about, you know, the very complex terminology, there's a lot of technology involved in it, I would encourage you to just power through it anyway, because the storyline progresses in a way that is very easy to follow, even though some of the contextual politics gets lost in the background. But I wanted to highlight the fear of litany
Hey guys, quick editor's note here. My name's Hosna, and as I'm editing this video, Emma has pulled me aside to inform me that she has misspoke, and she meant to say litany of fear instead of fear of litany, and is thus forever haunted. She is internally humiliated, embarrassed, and ashamed of herself. Thank you so much for listening, and let's get back into the episode.
As it is known in Dune, the quote that I have pulled. And I won't read it all because it is quite lengthy, but this litany of fear is repeated by several characters, especially Paul, throughout the book. And it's something that he says to himself in times of great struggle, when he needs to really focus as he's preparing to do something a little bit intense. And he says, I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. And ultimately, where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain. A very iconic hero line to say in times of struggle. So anyway, I know it can be a little bit intimidating to look at this dense text, but I would very much encourage anyone remotely interested in the sci-fi genre to give it a chance.
You might have convinced me, I must admit. Also,
I'm so glad.
Can we just admire how beautiful this
Isn't she gorgeous?
Copy of the book
She's beautiful. She has some gold lining on the pages. I love it. Definitely motivates me just to hold on to the book if I'm like, oh, I don't want to read this density, but it's pretty beautiful to hold, so it makes it worth it.
All right, so I believe Dune was the lengthiest book on our list today. So we will now be transitioning into what I believe to be the shortest book, which is Rizzio by Denise Mina. And this book was published in 2021. It is the first book of the Darkland Tales, which is an ongoing series that sort of retells dark episodes of Scottish history from a modern perspective.
That's fun.
Yes, and I really like it. If you're looking for something that's like brief, to the point, short, but also a very satisfying narrative nonetheless, this is something that I would definitely recommend. I actually just finished it this week, and I'm so excited to be able to talk about it. Essentially, though, it is called Rizzio, named after one of the most important characters at play here, which is David Rizzio. He was Mary Stuart's close friend and personal secretary, Mary Queen of Scots, and he was assassinated in her private palace. They were having dinner together, and around 80 conspirators stormed into her private chambers, and they dragged him away.
Dragged?
Dragged?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Dragged him away. And he was tragically stabbed to death over 50 times.
Oh my.
By these men.
Oh,
yes.
no.
In front of a very pregnant, I believe 6 months pregnant, Mary Queen of Scots. So it was shocking, it was horrific, and the story just sort of touches on how everything can change so quickly over the span of that one night for a very young queen early on into her second marriage, I believe, but who's just trying to serve her men and serve her country, and people are conspiring against her. They believe her to be the weaker sex, and this was a ploy against her legitimacy as queen, and it just basically covers that event and also the interesting aftermath of that.
It sounds like it. And I wanted to ask you, I personally love historical fiction, but I think a lot of people maybe are hesitant to experiment with the genre because they feel like it's just kind of like reading a history textbook in a slightly more dolled up sort of format. So why do you think, historical fiction, specifically Rizzio, is relevant to modern day readers?
I'm glad you asked. Well, something that I loved about this book was it was narrated from third person point of view, so quite removed. And the narrator, maybe the author herself, maybe just sort of a separate presence altogether, would frequently sort of interject with a contemporary lens to sort of almost poke fun at these conspirators who thought that they were so grand and that they were on top of the world for murdering this pregnant woman's close friend right in front of her. And they thought that they were really seizing the power and changing the course of history, when in reality she would regain her power pretty much shortly after. The coup didn't really change anything too substantial. Of course, it was emotionally traumatizing, but they didn't really accomplish what they thought they would, especially because her husband at the time, Henry Darnley, was actually involved in this conspiracy. The way that Mina sort of paints it is he wants to be recognized as a king. He wants to have the power that that title holds. Mary is sort of the primary monarch in this instance instead of him. So I just love how the narrator will interject at certain points and sort of poke fun at these great men and sort of offer the modern viewpoint that they weren't great at all. Instead, they were cowards.
Yeah.
They were cowards and they were selfish and they were everything that is evil about humankind. Yeah. So I liked that.
Tell me about this quote here.
The quote does pertain to that quite a bit. So this is from the point of view of Henry Yare, who was also involved in the conspiracy, and it said, "Compassion betides him. A proud young woman, visibly with child, is attacked by men working in concert. We are cowards, he thinks. What we're doing is wrong. The men are enjoying this. Our queen is trampled meat." Oof. Yeah, so just that image of trampled meat is quite
graphic.
Quite graphic and vivid imagery there, and I believe that that's what the title of the chapter is called within the book as well, so I was wondering how that would play out, and when it got to that point, I sort of did let out like a soft little gasp at that moment, because I just thought it was a perfect description for how they were treating Mary, and knowing her fate almost makes it even worse because she is eventually executed. I believe at the hands of Elizabeth Tudor, but don't quote me on that, although
someone fact check.
Yeah, someone fact check right now. But yeah, so just knowing that her fate eventually is execution, and that even if she could get herself out of this one with the support of her people, a darker fate still awaits her and those who were in support of her, like Rizzio. But yeah, just the phrase, "our queen is trampled meat," is something that will probably stick with me for a long time.
Yes, no kidding. I haven't read it and I already feel that way. And what's this one? Hex?
What is this?
Hex?
What is this, you ask? This is the second book of the same series. They're all written by different authors too, which I think is great because you get to hear different voices, you get to hear different approaches to these dark patches of history. So this one is about the North Berwick witch trials. I hope I said that right. But I'm very excited to dive into this one next, written by Jenny Fagan. So yes, I will be continuing the series, and I hope that some of you might consider picking it up.
Yes, you'll have to let us know how it is.
You will have to let us know.
And another book released in 2021, but again, quite distinct from the previous novel, is called A Little Hope by Ethan Joella. And this book is equal parts heart-wrenching and heartwarming, I have to say. Many tears, both of sadness and happiness, were released during my reading of the novel. It's very basically about a series of people living in a small town in Connecticut who are all connected to each other in various different ways. And the book alternates per chapter perspective, so I think maybe 8 to 10 characters alternate narrating the different chapters. And they all are going through their own very unique, very real struggles, things that are very relatable, everything from first love to heartbreak to illness to death of a loved one, just things that are very human. And because of that versatility and relatability in the kinds of issues that they go through, you just feel like you can relate to every character on some level or another. And yeah, it just makes it such a beautiful read for really anyone, because I can guarantee that no matter what stage you're in life right now, you will find a character with whom you just really feel you relate. So I would very much recommend A Little Hope to anyone.
I am a fan of multiple viewpoints myself.
Yes.
But if I had a question for you on that front, it would be, from the plot points that you were describing, it might seem a little bit heart-wrenching at its core. It seems like it can be a very emotional reading experience. So maybe for students who are seeking out something a little bit more lighthearted in their free time, I know that hope is in the title, but is there maybe a thread of optimism or just anything that you can speak on in regard to happiness down the line?
Yeah, no, that's a very valid, very legitimate question, because I know that sometimes after a long day, the very last thing I want to do is pick up such a depressingly worded story about someone's life. I will say there are moments reading this book where you're like, oh my God, can it get sadder? Like, there are moments where you're in it and you're like, I have to put this book down. I cannot read another chapter. It's just too much right now. But at a certain point, you realize that it is all going somewhere and that it is not just, you know, needless sad. There is a point to it. It's all headed in a direction, and that direction, as you will come to find out, does end up in a place of hope. So I can very much see this sort of hesitancy to read it because of its sad nature, but as the title suggests, it does all have a happy ending, so to speak, whether that's in the traditional sense or not. And yes, the quote that I pulled from this book, I think, reflects some of that, just inherent sadness about it because of the struggles that the characters go through. The quote reads, "She has never cared as much about anything as she did about him. That is what she is feeling now, leftover particles of the care she once felt. What do you do with that?" And I think that's like a perfect encapsulation of just how exactly, wiping the tears away. A perfect encapsulation of how the struggles that these people experience are not, these grandiose, hard to imagine, overly dramatized life events. They're so real, they're so relatable. And they're just about how you persevere in the face of loss and sadness. So yes, sad, definitely, but also hopeful, certainly as well. Well, everyone, this has been our show, and we thank you all for watching this far.
We will see you all for our next episode about what to eat with a special guest appearance from one of our fellow Lantern staffers.